Why are you standing between us? Jimin's voice cracked, trembling with both fury and despair as the rehearsal room's fluorescent lights flickered above them. Jungkook froze, his breath shallow, his gaze darting between Jimin and the figure who had just stepped forward, someone who wasn't supposed to be there, someone who claimed to help but whose presence already felt like a fracture in their fragile unity. The air was heavy with the scent of sweat and dust, the echo of music still lingering in the walls. Jungkook's hand twitched, as if reaching for Jimin, but stopped midway, paralyzed by guilt. The third person, gentle eyes, soft-spoken words, had come with promises of guidance, of easing the burden that fame had carved into their souls. Yet every word spoken seemed to carve deeper wounds instead of healing them. Jimin's chest rose and fell rapidly, his thoughts spiraling. He remembered the nights when Jungkook's laughter was his anchor, when their synchronized steps on stage felt like destiny. Now that rhythm faltered. The third figure's advice, though kind in tone, carried unintended consequences, whispered doubts, subtle comparisons, and a shadow that grew between them. Jungkook's silence was louder than any confession. He wanted to believe this newcomer was a friend, someone who could help them balance the chaos of their careers. But beneath that hope was fear, the fear that Jimin's trust was slipping away, that every glance now carried suspicion instead of warmth. The rehearsal mirrors reflected 3 figures instead of 2, and in that reflection Jimin saw betrayal. His fists clenched, nails digging into his palms as he fought back tears. He wanted to scream, to demand why Jungkook allowed someone else to stand in the space that once belonged only to them. The third person stepped closer, voice calm yet piercing. "I only wanted to help." But the words, meant to soothe, struck like a blade. Jimin turned away, his vision blurred, his heart pounding with the realization that help had become intrusion, and intrusion had become division. And in that moment, the harmony that once defined them began to unravel, thread by thread, under the weight of a presence that was never meant to destroy, but did. "Do you even trust me anymore?" Jungkook's voice broke through the silence, raw and trembling, as the night pressed heavy against the windows of the dorm. The city outside was alive with neon lights and distant sirens, but inside, the air was suffocating, thick with words left unsaid. Jimin sat on the edge of his bed, his hands gripping the sheets so tightly that his knuckles turned white. The third figure's presence lingered like a ghost, even when they weren't physically there. Their advice had seeped into Jungkook's mind, twisting his intentions, making him second-guess every move. Jimin could see it, the hesitation in Jungkook's eyes, the way his laughter no longer reached him fully, the way his touch felt uncertain. Jimin's heart ached with memories of simpler days, when their bond was unshakable, when every performance was a promise of unity. Now, that promise felt fragile, threatened by whispers of comparison and subtle manipulations. He wanted to believe Jungkook still stood by him, but the cracks were widening, and the silence between them was louder than any argument. Jungkook paced the room, his shadow stretching across the walls. He was torn between loyalty and doubt, between the comfort of Jimin's trust and the allure of guidance from someone who claimed to understand his struggles. His chest tightened with guilt. He never wanted to hurt Jimin, yet every choice seemed to push him further away. The tension snapped when Jimin finally spoke, his voice low but sharp. "You let them stand between us. You let them decide what we should be." His words carried the weight of betrayal, each syllable cutting deeper than any blade. Jungkook stopped, his breath shallow, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. He wanted to reach out to bridge the distance, but fear held him back. Fear that Jimin's trust was already gone, fear that the bond they had built was slipping beyond repair. The room was filled with echoes of laughter, of promises, of dreams they once shared. Now those echoes twisted into doubts, haunting them both. The third person had not meant to destroy, but their presence had become a wedge, a reminder that even the strongest bonds could fracture under the weight of misunderstanding. And as the night deepened, Jimin turned away, his heart heavy with the realization that love alone might not be enough to mend what was breaking. Jungkook stood frozen, caught between the desire to fight for them and the fear that he had already lost. The silence that followed was not empty. It was filled with the sound of trust unraveling, thread by thread, leaving both of them standing on opposite sides of a chasm they never intended to create. "Fractures beneath the surface. Stop pretending everything is fine." Jimin's voice thundered through the practice hall, echoing against the walls like a storm breaking loose. His chest heaved, his fists clenched, and his eyes burned with a mixture of rage and sorrow. Jungkook stood frozen, his lips parted but no words escaping, as if the weight of Jimin's accusation had stolen his breath. The third figure lingered in the corner, silent yet undeniably present. Their calm demeanor was a cruel contrast to the chaos unraveling between the two. They had come with promises of balance, of helping Jimin and Jungkook navigate the crushing expectations of fame. But every suggestion, every subtle correction, had become a wedge, driving them further apart. Jimin's memories clawed at him, nights of whispered encouragement, mornings filled with laughter, the unspoken rhythm that bound him to Jungkook. Now, that rhythm was broken, replaced by hesitation and mistrust. He could feel the distance growing, not just in words but in the way Jungkook's gaze faltered, the way his voice trembled when he tried to explain. Jungkook's heart pounded, torn between defending himself and confessing the truth. He wanted to believe the third person's guidance was harmless, that it was meant to ease the burden he carried. But deep down, he knew Jimin was right. The advice had planted seeds of doubt, reshaping his thoughts, making him question the very bond that had once been unshakable. The air was thick with tension, the smell of sweat and dust mingling with the sharp sting of betrayal. Jimin stepped closer, his voice trembling now, softer but more dangerous. "You let them rewrite us. You let them decide who we are." Jungkook's throat tightened, his eyes shimmering with guilt. He wanted to reach out to hold Jimin to prove that nothing had changed. But the silence between them was a chasm, and every attempt to cross it only seemed to widen the gap. The third figure finally spoke, their tone calm yet piercing. "I only wanted to help you both." But the words, meant to soothe, only deepened the wound. Jimin's jaw tightened, his heart aching with the realization that help had become interference, and interference had become destruction. The mirrors reflected three figures, Jimin, Jungkook, and the intruder, and in that reflection, Jimin saw the truth. Their bond was no longer theirs alone. It had been invaded, reshaped, and fractured. And as the rehearsal lights dimmed, the silence that followed was not peace. It was the sound of trust collapsing, leaving behind only echoes of what once was. The weight of silence. "Don't walk away from me, Jungkook." Jimin's voice cracked, desperation bleeding into anger as his footsteps echoed down the dimly lit corridor. Jungkook stopped, his back rigid, his fists clenched at his sides. The silence between them was unbearable, heavier than any scream, more suffocating than any fight. The third figure had left the room minutes earlier, but their shadow remained, lingering in every thought, every hesitation. Jimin's chest burned with betrayal, his mind replaying every moment when Jungkook had chosen to listen to someone else instead of him. He wanted to believe Jungkook still cared, but the silence was louder than any promise. Jungkook turned slowly, his eyes dark with conflict. He wanted to explain, to tell Jimin that he never meant to let anyone come between them. But the words tangled in his throat, poisoned by guilt. He remembered the advice whispered to him, advice that seemed logical, even kind, but had planted seeds of doubt in his heart, seeds that now grew into walls separating him from Jimin. Jimin stepped closer, his voice trembling. "You think they understand us better than I do? You think they know what we've been through?" His words were sharp, but beneath them was pain, a plea for reassurance that never came. The corridor smelled faintly of cleaning chemicals, the cold air brushing against their skin. Jungkook's breath was shallow, his pulse racing. He wanted to reach out to hold Jimin to erase the distance. But fear held him back, fear that Jimin no longer trusted him, fear that every touch would feel like betrayal. Jimin's eyes glistened, his anger giving way to sorrow. He remembered the nights when Jungkook's laughter was his anchor, when their bond was unshakable. Now that bond felt fragile, threatened by a presence that claimed to help but only deepened the cracks. The silence stretched, unbearable, until Jungkook finally whispered, "I don't know how to fix this." The words hung in the air, heavy and final. Jimin's heart clenched, his breath catching as he realized that love alone might not be enough to mend what was breaking. The third figure had not meant to destroy, but their presence had become a wedge, a reminder that even the strongest bonds could fracture under the weight of silence. And as the corridor lights flickered above them, Jimin turned away, his footsteps echoing like a farewell. Jungkook stood frozen, his heart aching with the knowledge that every moment of silence was another thread unraveling, leaving them both standing on opposite sides of a bond they once believed unbreakable. "Lie to me, Jungkook." Jimin's voice was low, almost a whisper, but it carried the sharpness of a blade. The rehearsal room was empty now, the echoes of music replaced by the hum of silence. The mirrors reflected their fractured figures, two souls standing apart, yet bound by invisible threads of history and pain. Jungkook's shoulders slumped, his eyes heavy with exhaustion. He wanted to deny it, to insist that nothing had changed, but the truth pressed against his chest like a weight he could no longer carry. The third figure's words had seeped into his mind, reshaping his thoughts, making him question the very foundation of his bond with Jimin. Jimin stepped closer, his breath uneven, his heart pounding with a mixture of anger and sorrow. "You let them decide for us. You let them tell you who we should be." His voice trembled, but his gaze was unwavering, piercing through Jungkook's silence. The air smelled faintly of sweat and stale coffee, the remnants of long nights spent chasing perfection. Jungkook's throat tightened, his hands trembling as he tried to speak. "I thought they were helping, I thought they understood." His words were fragile, breaking apart as soon as they left his lips. Jimin's chest ached, memories flooding him, nights of laughter, mornings of shared dreams, the unspoken rhythm that once bound them together. Now that rhythm was broken, replaced by hesitation and mistrust. He wanted to believe Jungkook still stood by him, but the cracks were too deep, the silence too heavy. The third figure entered quietly, their presence calm yet unsettling. "I only wanted to ease the burden," they said softly, their tone almost pleading. But the words meant to heal only deepened the wound. Jimin's jaw tightened, his heart burning with the realization that help had become intrusion, and intrusion had become betrayal. Jungkook's eyes glistened, his voice breaking. "I don't know how to make this right." The mirrors reflected three figures once again, but the image was distorted, fractured. Jimin saw not unity, but division, an uninvited shadow standing between them, reshaping what was once unbreakable. And as the rehearsal lights dimmed, the silence that followed was not peace. It was the sound of trust collapsing further, leaving them both standing on opposite sides of a bond that was slipping beyond repair. The music cut abruptly, leaving only the sound of Jimin's breath, sharp, uneven, trembling with emotions he could no longer contain. He stood in the center of the rehearsal stage, his body rigid, his eyes locked on Jungkook, who had just finished a sequence with Taehyung. The choreography was flawless, but to Jimin it felt like betrayal, every synchronized step a reminder that Jungkook had leaned on someone else instead of him. The mirrors reflected Jimin's pain back at him, his expression caught between fury and heartbreak. Jungkook's chest rose and fell rapidly, sweat dripping down his temples, his gaze flickering toward Jimin with silent pleading. He wanted to explain, to tell Jimin that Taehyung's support was not meant to replace him, but the words dissolved before they could form. Taehyung stood quietly at the edge, his eyes heavy with guilt. He had only wanted to help, to steady Jungkook when his confidence faltered, but now he realized his presence had become the spark that ignited Jimin's anguish. The third figure's influence lingered in the background, invisible yet undeniable, twisting every action into suspicion, every gesture into doubt. Jimin's voice finally broke the silence, low but sharp. "You don't need me anymore, do you?" His words were heavy, each syllable dripping with sorrow. Jungkook flinched, his heart aching, his hands trembling as he reached out instinctively, but Jimin stepped back. The distance between them widening like a chasm. The rehearsal hall smelled of sweat and dust, the air thick with tension. Jungkook's throat tightened, his voice cracking as he whispered, "I do need you, more than anyone." But Jimin's silence was louder, his eyes filled with pain that no reassurance could erase. Taehyung's gaze shifted between them, his own heart torn. He wanted to speak, to explain, but he knew his words would only deepen the wound. The third figure's shadow loomed larger now, their well-meaning guidance having spiraled into chaos, leaving the three of them trapped in a web of mistrust. Jimin turned away, his movements sharp, his body trembling with suppressed tears. Jungkook stood frozen, his chest heavy with guilt, his mind screaming for a way to mend what was breaking. Taehyung lowered his head, silently pleading for unity, but the silence that followed was unbearable. The stage lights dimmed, casting long shadows across the floor. And in that silence, Jimin's pain became a wall, Jungkook's guilt became a chain, and Taehyung's presence became the wedge that none of them had intended, but all of them now felt. The harmony that once defined them was gone, replaced by silence so heavy it threatened to crush them all.
"Cracks in the rhythm, why does it feel like you're not here anymore?" Jimin's voice trembled, his words slicing through the dim rehearsal hall like a confession he had held back too long. The room was silent except for the faint hum of the speakers, the smell of sweat and dust clinging to the air. Jungkook stood across from him, his body tense, his eyes shadowed with guilt. The third figure's influence had grown invisible yet undeniable, shaping every hesitation, every faltering step. Jimin could feel it, the way Jungkook's gaze no longer lingered, the way his laughter felt muted, the way his presence seemed to drift even when he stood right beside him. Jungkook's chest tightened, his breath shallow. He wanted to speak, to tell Jimin that nothing had changed, that he still needed him more than anyone. But the words dissolved before they could leave his lips, poisoned by doubt. He remembered the advice whispered to him, the comparisons made, the subtle suggestions that had seemed harmless but now echoed like accusations. Jimin stepped closer, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. "We used to move as one. Now every step feels like you're pulling away." His voice cracked, heavy with sorrow. He remembered the nights when Jungkook's laughter was his anchor, when their bond was unshakable. Now that bond felt fragile, threatened by shadows that neither of them had invited but both of them now carried. Jungkook's hands trembled, his voice breaking. "I don't want to lose you." The words were raw, desperate, but Jimin's silence was louder, his pain etched into every line of his face. The rehearsal mirrors reflected their fractured figures, two souls standing apart, bound by history yet divided by mistrust. The third figure's shadow loomed larger, their well-meaning guidance having spiraled into chaos, leaving Jimin and Jungkook trapped in a web of suspicion. The air was heavy, suffocating, as Jimin turned away, his footsteps echoing like a farewell. Jungkook stood frozen, his heart aching with the knowledge that every moment of silence was another thread unraveling, leaving them both standing on opposite sides of a bond that once felt unbreakable. And as the lights dimmed, the rhythm that once defined them faltered, replaced by silence so heavy it threatened to crush them both. The breaking point, "Say it, Jungkook. Say what you're afraid of." Jimin's voice was sharp, trembling with both fury and desperation, as the two of them stood alone in the dim backstage corridor. The muffled roar of the crowd outside was a cruel reminder of the world that demanded perfection, while inside their bond was unraveling thread by thread. Jungkook's lips parted but no words came. His chest rose and fell rapidly, his fists clenched at his sides. He wanted to confess, to admit that the third figure's words had twisted his thoughts, that every piece of advice had planted doubts he couldn't silence. But fear held him back, fear that Jimin would see it as betrayal, fear that speaking the truth would shatter what little remained between them. Jimin's eyes glistened, his anger giving way to sorrow. "You let them inside your head. You let them decide who we are." His voice cracked, heavy with pain. He remembered the nights when Jungkook's laughter was his anchor, when their rhythm was unshakable. Now that rhythm faltered, broken by hesitation and mistrust. The corridor smelled faintly of sweat and dust, the air thick with tension. Jungkook's throat tightened, his voice finally breaking. "I thought they were helping me, helping us, but now I don't know who I am when I'm with you." His words were raw, desperate, but they cut deeper than silence. Jimin's chest ached, his breath catching as he realized the depth of Jungkook's confusion. He wanted to reach out, to hold him, to remind him of the bond they had built, but his hands remained at his sides, trembling with suppressed emotion. The third figure appeared at the end of the corridor, their presence calm yet unsettling. "I only wanted to ease the burden," they said softly, their tone almost pleading. But the words, meant to heal, only deepened the wound. Jimin's jaw tightened, his heart burning with the realization that help had become intrusion, and intrusion had become destruction. Jungkook's eyes shimmered with guilt, his voice breaking once more. "I don't know how to fix this." The silence that followed was unbearable, filled with echoes of laughter, promises, and dreams that once defined them. Now those echoes twisted into doubts, haunting them both. And as the backstage lights flickered above, Jimin turned away, his footsteps echoing like a farewell. Jungkook stood frozen, his heart aching with the knowledge that every moment of silence was another fracture, leaving them both standing on opposite sides of a bond that once felt unbreakable. "The edge of collapse, don't you see what's happening to us?" Jimin's voice was hoarse, his words trembling as they spilled into the quiet of the dorm. The night pressed heavy against the windows, the city outside alive with neon lights, but inside the air was suffocating, thick with mistrust and sorrow. Jungkook sat hunched on the couch, his hands buried in his hair, his chest rising and falling with uneven breaths. The third figure's shadow lingered in every corner, invisible yet undeniable. Their advice had been meant to guide, to ease the crushing weight of expectation, but instead it had carved a canyon between Jimin and Jungkook. Every word, every subtle suggestion had become a wedge, twisting their bond into something fragile and uncertain. Jimin's eyes glistened, his anger giving way to despair. He remembered the nights when Jungkook's laughter was his anchor, when their bond was unshakable. Now that bond felt like glass, cracked, splintered, ready to shatter with the slightest touch. "You let them inside your head," he whispered, his voice breaking. "And now I don't know if you're still mine." Jungkook's throat tightened, his voice trembling as he finally spoke. I thought they were helping us, but now I don't even know who I am when I'm with you. His words were raw, desperate, but they cut deeper than silence. The dorm smelled faintly of coffee and exhaustion, the remnants of sleepless nights spent chasing perfection. Jimin's chest ached, his breath catching as he realized the depth of Jungkook's confusion. He wanted to reach out to hold him, to remind him of the bond they had built, but his hands remained at his sides, trembling with suppressed emotion. The third figure appeared quietly, their presence calm yet unsettling. I only wanted to ease the burden, they said softly, their tone almost pleading, but the words, meant to heal, only deepened the wound. Jimin's jaw tightened, his heart burning with the realization that help had become intrusion and intrusion had become destruction. Jungkook's eyes shimmered with guilt, his voice breaking once more. I don't know how to fix this. The silence that followed was unbearable, filled with echoes of laughter, promises and dreams that once defined them. Now those echoes twisted into doubts, haunting them both. And as the night deepened, Jimin turned away, his footsteps echoing like a farewell. Jungkook sat frozen, his heart aching with the knowledge that every moment of silence was another fracture, leaving them both standing on opposite sides of a bond that once felt unbreakable. The final note, is this the end for us? Jimin's voice was barely audible, a whisper carried by the dim glow of the studio lights. His eyes shimmered with exhaustion, his body trembling as if the weight of every unspoken word had finally crushed him. Jungkook stood across the room, his chest tight, his breath uneven, his gaze locked on Jimin with a desperation that words could no longer contain. The third figure lingered in the doorway, silent, their presence heavy with regret. They had never meant to destroy, never meant to fracture the bond that had once been unshakable. Their guidance had been born of kindness, but kindness had twisted into intrusion, and intrusion had become the wedge that tore Jimin and Jungkook apart. Jimin's heart ached with memories, nights of laughter, mornings of shared dreams, the rhythm that once bound them together. Now that rhythm was broken, replaced by silence and mistrust. He wanted to believe Jungkook still stood by him, but the cracks were too deep, the silence too heavy. Jungkook's voice finally broke through, raw and trembling. I don't want to lose you, I never wanted this. His words were desperate, his eyes glistening with guilt. He stepped forward, his hands shaking, as if reaching for Jimin could erase the distance that had grown between them. Jimin's breath caught, his chest burning with sorrow. He wanted to reach back to hold Jungkook, to remind him of the bond they had built, but his hands remained at his sides, trembling with suppressed emotion. Then why did you let them stand between us? His voice cracked, heavy with pain. The third figure's eyes lowered, their voice soft. I only wanted to help. But the words, meant to heal, only deepened the wound. Jimin's jaw tightened, his heart burning with the realization that help had become destruction, and destruction had become the silence that now defined them. The studio smelled faintly of dust and sweat, the air thick with tension. The mirrors reflected three figures, fractured, divided, broken. Jimin saw not unity but separation. Jungkook saw not love but guilt. And the third figure saw not healing but regret. The silence stretched, unbearable, until Jimin finally whispered, maybe love isn't enough. His words hung in the air, heavy and final. Jungkook's chest tightened, his breath catching as he realized the truth, that even the strongest bonds could fracture under the weight of misunderstanding. And as the studio lights dimmed, the silence that followed was not peace. It was the sound of trust collapsing, leaving behind only echoes of what once was. The harmony that had defined them was gone, replaced by a final note that lingered in the air, haunting, unresolved and unforgettable, the fragile truth. Tell me, Jungkook, do you still believe in us? Jimin's voice was soft, trembling, yet it carried the weight of every sleepless night, every fractured rehearsal, every moment of silence that had stretched too long. The studio was dim, the faint hum of the speakers filling the emptiness between them. Jungkook stood near the mirrors, his reflection fractured, his eyes heavy with guilt. The third figure lingered at the edge of the room, their presence quiet but undeniable. They had never meant to destroy, never meant to fracture the bond that had once been unshakable. Yet their guidance had become a shadow, twisting every word, every gesture, until Jimin and Jungkook could no longer see each other clearly. Jimin's chest ached, his breath uneven. He remembered the nights when Jungkook's laughter was his anchor, when their bond was unshakable. Now that bond felt fragile, splintered by mistrust. You let them inside your head, he whispered, his voice breaking. And now I don't know if you're still mine. Jungkook's throat tightened, his voice trembling as he finally spoke. I thought they were helping us, but now I don't even know who I am when I'm with you. His words were raw, desperate, but they cut deeper than silence. The studio smelled faintly of dust and sweat, the air thick with tension. Jimin's eyes glistened, his anger giving way to sorrow. He wanted to reach out to hold Jungkook, to remind him of the bond they had built, but his hands remained at his sides, trembling with suppressed emotion. The third figure's voice broke the silence, soft and pleading. I only wanted to ease the burden. But the words, meant to heal, only deepened the wound. Jimin's jaw tightened, his heart burning with the realization that help had become intrusion, and intrusion had become destruction. Jungkook's eyes shimmered with guilt, his voice breaking once more. I don't want to lose you. The silence that followed was unbearable, filled with echoes of laughter, promises, and dreams that once defined them. Now those echoes twisted into doubts, haunting them both. And as the studio lights dimmed, Jimin turned away, his footsteps echoing like a farewell. Jungkook stood frozen, his heart aching with the knowledge that every moment of silence was another fracture, leaving them both standing on opposite sides of a bond that once felt unbreakable. Yet beneath the silence, something fragile remained, a truth neither of them could deny, a truth that whispered that even broken bonds could be mended, if only they dared to face the shadows together. The first fracture healed. Jimin, please, don't turn away this time. Jungkook's voice was raw, trembling as he stood in the quiet of the dorm kitchen. The faint hum of the refrigerator filled the silence, the smell of leftover coffee lingering in the air. Jimin's back was to him, his shoulders rigid, his hands gripping the counter as if holding himself together. For the first time in weeks, Jungkook's words carried no defense, no excuses, only truth. His chest ached with guilt, his breath uneven as he finally let the walls crumble. I let them inside my head. I let their words change me, and I hurt you because of it. His voice cracked, heavy with remorse. Jimin's eyes closed, his heart pounding. He had waited for this, for Jungkook to admit what had been tearing them apart. Slowly he turned, his gaze meeting Jungkook, his expression a mixture of pain and longing. Do you even know what that did to me? His voice trembled, but beneath it was a plea, a fragile hope that maybe, just maybe, they could find their way back. The third figure lingered in the doorway, silent, their presence heavy with regret. They had never meant to destroy. Never meant to fracture the bond that had once been unshakable. Their guidance had been born of kindness, but kindness had twisted into intrusion, and intrusion had become the wedge that tore Jimin and Jungkook apart. Jungkook stepped closer, his hands trembling. I don't want anyone else between us. I don't want anyone else deciding who we are. I only want you. His words were desperate, but they carried a sincerity that pierced through the silence. Jimin's chest ached, his breath uneven. Wanted to believe, wanted to trust again. His eyes glistened, his voice breaking as he whispered, then prove it, not with words, with us. The air was heavy, but something shifted, something fragile, something real. Jungkook reached out, his hand trembling as it hovered near Jimin's. For a moment, Jimin hesitated, his heart torn between fear and hope. Then slowly he let his fingers intertwine with Jungkook, the touch electric, fragile but alive. The third figure lowered their gaze, their voice soft. I only wanted to help, but I see now I need to step back. Their words carried regret, but also release. For the first time, their presence did not feel like a wedge. It felt like a door closing, allowing Jimin and Jungkook to face each other without shadows. The silence that followed was not unbearable. It was fragile, tentative, filled with the possibility of healing. Jimin's heart still ached, Jungkook's guilt still lingered, but between them was a spark, a fragile truth that whispered that even broken bonds could be mended. And as the night deepened, their hands remained clasped, fragile yet unyielding, a promise that the first fracture had begun to heal.